Alex stared into the mirror, his reflection looking back at him as usual. But there was something different about today. Something subtle yet unnerving. His eyes, usually sharp and full of life, seemed distant. The kind of distant you get when you're lost in thought or perhaps haunted by a memory. It wasn't that he wasn't used to mirrors. In fact, Alex had always been a bit obsessed with them. He had inherited this antique mirror from his grandmother, a large, ornate piece with a thick wooden frame carved with intricate designs. The mirror had stood in the family for generations, passed down with a mysterious legacy that his grandmother rarely talked about. As a child, Alex had always been told that the mirror had a history. His grandmother would smile wistfully whenever she mentioned it, but she never gave much detail. It was as though the mirror held some kind of unspoken secret, a story only the reflections knew. Alex had dismissed it as an old woman's superstition, something to pass the time when the house grew too quiet and the shadows crept in. But today something felt off. He leaned closer to the mirror, studying his own reflection more intently. His face was still there, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a slight shift in the way his image moved. It wasn't like the smooth, synchronized reflection he was used to. No, this time it seemed to have a mind of its own just for a moment. His reflection blinked at a different time than he did. "Okay, this is strange," Alex muttered, taking a step back. He had been feeling tired lately, overworked perhaps. He had a demanding job at a tech startup, and the stress of deadlines and constant pressure was starting to take its toll. Maybe his mind was just playing tricks on him. He laughed softly at the thought and tried to dismiss the creeping unease in his chest. But as he turned to walk away, something caught his eye. The reflection in the mirror, his reflection, was still staring at him. It wasn't moving. It wasn't blinking. Alex froze. He couldn't believe it. His reflection wasn't following his movements anymore. The air around him seemed to grow colder, as though the space between him and the mirror had expanded. "Hello," he called, his voice breaking the silence of the room. His reflection didn't answer, of course, but it didn't look like it was waiting for something either. Instead, it seemed different. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was moving. Alex could see it now, the reflection slowly lifting its hand, mirroring his own. But then, it stayed frozen in place, holding its hand out as if reaching for something. Alex's heart began to race. "It's just a trick of the light," he tried to convince himself, turning away and shaking his head. But the reflection didn't stop. It seemed to follow his every movement, as if mocking him, keeping just a few steps behind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. He looked back at the mirror again. The reflection was still there, but now it was smiling. A cold, knowing smile that didn't match the confusion in his eyes. It was as if it had its own thoughts, its own will. The next morning, Alex couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. It was impossible to ignore. He had tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, as stress, or perhaps even a bad dream, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. That smile in the reflection, it wasn't something he could shake. He had tried to distract himself the night before by calling his friend, Emma. She had always been his grounding force, the one person he could trust to snap him out of his spiraling thoughts. But even Emma, with her logical, no-nonsense attitude, had seemed strange on the phone. She was skeptical at first, but then she suggested something that made his skin crawl even more. "Maybe you should get rid of it," Emma had said casually, but Alex could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "If it's that weird, just get rid of the mirror. Don't keep something that's making you feel uncomfortable." The idea of getting rid of the mirror had crossed Alex's mind, but it didn't sit right. He didn't want to part with it. It had been in his family for years, and somehow, He couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror held more than just his reflection. It felt as though it was a part of him, a connection to something deeper, something older than him. But the next day, when Alex returned home from work, the sense of unease grew stronger. The mirror seemed to loom in the corner of the room, waiting for him. As he walked past it, he couldn't resist the urge to glance at his reflection. At first, everything seemed normal, but as he looked closer, his stomach churned. The reflection was no longer an exact copy of him. His image was standing still, his hands clasped behind his back, staring blankly ahead. But the eyes were different. They were colder, sharper, and for a split second, they seemed to look directly at him, as though they were aware of his presence. The longer Alex stared, the more the reflection seemed to shift. It was subtle at first. His reflection shifted its weight slightly, as if preparing to move. Then, it reached out, its hand extending toward the glass, pressing against the surface. The moment felt unnatural, like the mirror was a barrier between two worlds, and something was trying to cross it. His own hand, frozen by the fear creeping up his spine, reached out instinctively, touching the cool surface of the glass. But the reflection didn't move in sync with him. Instead, it began to move independently, slowly stepping forward, as though it were trying to escape the confines of the mirror. Alex stumbled back in shock. His breath caught in his throat. This couldn't be happening. The reflection was alive. It was moving on its own with no regard for him. No longer simply mimicking his actions, it seemed to have gained a life of its own. The sensation of the reflection moving without him was unlike anything Alex had ever experienced. The chill creeping up his spine only deepened as his reflection, his own image, stepped forward, breaking the rules of what was supposed to happen in front of a mirror. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears, the room around him suddenly feeling too small. The reflection, it was no longer mimicking him. It was no longer just a reflection. It was something else, something separate. Alex couldn't take his eyes off it. Every movement was slow, deliberate, as if the reflection was becoming aware of its own existence, pulling away from its role as a mere echo of him. The reflection moved its arm again, but this time the action was different. It reached out of the mirror, its hand going beyond the surface, as if trying to escape. Alex's breath hitched as the fingers of the reflection brushed against the edge of the frame. The glass shimmered for a second, warping, bending like it was no longer a solid barrier. His skin prickled with the rising fear, and before he could react, the reflection smiled at him. An eerie, malicious grin. The room felt colder. The air grew thick, as if something was pressing against him from all sides. Alex's pulse raced as he stood frozen, unable to look away from the mirror. His reflection, his own image, was now beyond the glass. It had crossed the barrier, its fingers curled around the edge of the frame, pressing against the wood as though trying to pull itself free. His heart hammered in his chest. This couldn't be real. Couldn't be. Mirrors didn't work this way. They didn't have minds of their own. But here it was, his reflection, no longer just a reflection. With every passing second, the figure in the mirror grew more distinct. It wasn't just mimicking his movements anymore. It wasn't just following him. It was starting to act on its own expressions, its own body language. It was alive. Alex's breath was shallow, every muscle in his body screaming to move, but his feet were glued to the floor. The reflection in the mirror, it smiled. Not the kind of smile he was used to. No, this one was wide, sinister, full of something dark, something that wasn't him. A deep, icy chill swept through him, and in a sudden panic, Alex stumbled back. He could feel his heart racing faster now, almost as though it was in sync with the dark figure in the mirror. It reached further out of the glass, and Alex couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, he bolted for the door. His footsteps echoed in the silence, a frantic rhythm of fear. He glanced back one last time before he dashed out of the room, the door slamming shut behind him with a loud bang. The hallway outside felt strangely normal. No eerie echoes, no strange noises, but the pounding of his heart wouldn't stop. The fear was too much. It clawed at his insides, twisting his stomach into knots. He rushed down the stairs, needing to get away from that thing, from the mirror. He could feel the weight of its gaze, as though it was still watching him, still waiting for the moment when it could reach him again. Alex hadn't realized how far he had walked until he found himself standing outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. He paused for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to steady himself. He tried to rationalize what had just happened, but there was no explanation. He had to get rid of the mirror. That was the only answer. But as he turned back toward the house, he felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was a pull, a tug, as if the house itself was calling to him. The mirror was still there, waiting, and a part of him, deep down, knew he couldn't run forever. Inside the house, everything was silent. Too silent. Alex could hear his own breath, ragged and uneven, as he walked back into the room where the mirror stood. He didn't want to go back. He didn't want to face it again. But something was drawing him back in. He stepped slowly toward the mirror. The reflection was no longer in the glass. It was gone. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, relief flooding him for a moment. But that feeling didn't last long. The glass was now dark, murky, like a shadow was lurking just behind it. The reflection wasn't gone. It was waiting. Alex reached out a trembling hand toward the surface of the mirror. His fingers hovered just inches from the cold glass, and for a moment he hesitated. Was it safe? Could he touch it? He didn't want to, but he knew he had no choice. The moment his hand brushed the surface, the room seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, the temperature dropping drastically. His reflection reappeared, but this time it wasn't standing still. It moved. It tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion, and its eyes locked onto his with a knowing look. Alex's breath caught in his throat as he stumbled backward. The reflection mimicked his movements, but it wasn't just following him. It was studying him, as if it were learning from him, becoming more aware of him. Alex's stomach churned. This wasn't just some strange illusion. This wasn't just his mind playing tricks on him. The reflection was becoming him. Or at least it was becoming something more. He backed away from the mirror, his body shaking with the intensity of what he had just witnessed. But as he turned to leave, the reflection stepped forward, its hand reaching out of the glass once again. And this time, it didn't stop. Alex could feel a coldness wrapping around him, as if the air had turned to ice. His skin felt numb as the figure in the mirror stretched its hand further toward him, its fingers brushing against the edge of the frame. It was coming for him. Panicked, Alex sprinted for the door, desperate to escape, but the sound of his own footsteps seemed to slow down, like time itself was stretching. The air felt thick, heavy, felt like he was running in slow motion. And then, the mirror's reflection whispered. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even clear, but the voice was there, clawing at the edges of his mind. The words didn't make sense at first, but they echoed in his thoughts. "You can't escape me." Alex froze in his tracks, his mind racing. He had to get out. He had to find a way to stop this. He could feel it, the coldness, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The house itself seemed to be shifting, twisting, like it was alive, and it was trapping him here. But where could he go? How could he escape something that was inside the very reflection staring back at him? He looked back, and the mirror seemed to shimmer, warping and distorting, as if something was trying to break free. His heart raced in his chest. He had to make a choice. He couldn't just stand there and wait. He had to do something. But what? What could he possibly do against something so unnatural? As he turned back toward the door, his reflection's smile grew wider, colder. It wasn't him anymore. It wasn't just a reflection. It had become something else, something darker, something far more dangerous. Alex couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on him. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. He tried to move, but his legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the floor. The mirror called to him. He couldn't escape it. No matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he went, it was always there, always watching, always waiting. He glanced at the reflection again. The figure was still there, but it wasn't just standing still anymore. It was moving, its fingers stretching out towards him, almost as if it were inviting him in, daring him to come closer. Alex felt a shiver run down his spine as he fought the urge to reach out, to touch the mirror, to see if it could really pull him in. But the reflection, no, the thing in the mirror wasn't just an image anymore. It was something real, something alive, and it was trying to drag him into its world. Alex stumbled back, his mind racing. How could he escape this? The house seemed to grow colder with every passing second. The floor beneath his feet creaked and groaned, as if the entire structure was alive, breathing with him. He could hear the wind howling outside, but it was muffled, distant, as if the house had swallowed the sound. His gaze snapped back to the mirror. The reflection of himself was still there, but it was different now. It looked like him, but there was something wrong about it. Its eyes were too dark, its smile too wide, too knowing. It wasn't just mimicking him anymore. It was becoming something else, something that was beyond him. Alex could feel a cold sweat trickling down his back. He turned away, desperate to break free from its pull, but something was tugging at him. The mirror was pulling at his very soul, and he felt like he couldn't escape. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was his prison. He ran toward the door, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. Panic surged in his chest. He pulled at the handle again and again, but it refused to open. His mind screamed, "I have to get out of here." But then he heard it, a low, guttural laugh coming from behind him. His blood ran cold. He didn't want to turn around, but he had no choice. Slowly, his eyes moved toward the mirror. The figure was standing there, its face twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile. It didn't look like Alex anymore. It was something darker, something more sinister, and its eyes, those eyes, burned with an unnatural intensity. Alex's breath hitched as he stared into the reflection. It was speaking now, its lips moving, but no sound came from its mouth. Instead, the words echoed in his mind. "You can't escape me, Alex. You belong to me now." The voice wasn't his own. It was cold, chilling, and full of malice. The reflection wasn't just a mirror image anymore. It had become something sentient, something that knew him better than he knew himself. Alex stumbled back from the mirror, his heart racing in his chest. He had to get away. He had to escape. But the reflection, no, the thing in the mirror, was right behind him, just inches away. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he couldn't tell if he was still in the room or if he had crossed over into the mirror itself. He reached out, his hand trembling, but he couldn't touch the glass. It felt like a wall of ice, cold and impenetrable. Suddenly, the room seemed to spin around him. The walls twisted, The ceiling seemed to lower, and the floor shifted beneath his feet. He grabbed the edge of the mirror for support, his fingers slipping on the cold surface. He could feel the reflection now, not just in the mirror, but all around him, pressing in, suffocating him. The voice echoed in his mind again, louder this time. "You are mine, forever." Alex screamed, but no sound came out. His mouth moved, but it was like the world had gone silent. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The air around him grew thick, suffocating, and he felt his body growing weaker with each passing second. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the feeling of being trapped, but it was no use. The mirror had him. It had taken him. He was no longer just Alex. He was part of the reflection now, trapped in a world that wasn't his own. And then the silence broke. A loud crash echoed through the room, and Alex's eyes snapped open. The world around him had returned to normal. The walls were solid again. The air was breathable, but the mirror was still there, and the reflection was still waiting. Alex could feel it, could feel the pull, the desire to reach out and touch it. He knew that if he let his guard down for even a second, the reflection would take him again. He would be lost. He stepped away from the mirror, his body shaking. He needed to think, to find a way out of this nightmare. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let that thing take him. But as he turned to leave the room, he caught one last glimpse of the reflection. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was him. Alex's heart stopped. The figure in the mirror was staring back at him, but it wasn't just a mimicry of his movements. It was him. Every tiny detail, every expression, every movement. It was as if the reflection had become its own entity. And Alex realized with a growing horror that he wasn't the only one trapped in the mirror. It had taken him, taken his soul, and now there was no way out. Alex woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. His breathing was ragged, as if he had been running for hours. His hands were trembling, and when he wiped his face, his fingers were wet with perspiration. He looked around. The room was silent, still, just the way it should have been. But something felt off. He sat up in bed, his mind racing. Had it all been a dream? The reflection, the mirror, that thing that had taken over his life. He wanted to believe it was just a nightmare, but deep down he knew the truth. It wasn't over. It wasn't just a bad dream. The reflection was still out there, waiting. Alex rubbed his face, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to him like a second skin. The walls felt like they were closing in. His own thoughts felt foreign to him, like they weren't his own anymore. He glanced toward the mirror in the corner of the room. The reflection was still there, not moving, but staring at him with those cold, lifeless eyes. He could feel its gaze piercing into him, the coldness seeping into his very bones. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape it. Alex stood up, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He stumbled toward the door, but as soon as his hand touched the handle, the room seemed to shift. The walls distorted, and the ceiling seemed to press down on him. His breath caught in his throat as the room began to spin. It was happening again. The mirror, once a simple reflection of his life, was taking control. It was warping reality, pulling him into a world that was not his own. The reflection in the mirror shifted. This time, it wasn't just staring back at him. It was smiling, a wide, unnatural smile that seemed to stretch on forever. Alex froze, his heart stopping in his chest. That smile, it was too real, too familiar. It was him. The reflection wasn't just mimicking him anymore. It had become him. It had taken his form, his identity, and now it was using it against him. He could feel his mind slipping, the weight of the reflection's gaze pressing down on him. It was controlling him now, making him move, making him feel things he couldn't explain. Alex took a step backward, but his body felt heavy, like something was holding him in place. He couldn't move, couldn't run. He was trapped. His smile in the mirror grew wider, and then the reflection spoke. But it wasn't his voice. It was a deeper, more sinister sound, a voice filled with malice. "You can't escape, Alex. You belong to me now." The words echoed in his mind, sending a shiver down his spine. He tried to scream, but his mouth wouldn't open. His chest tightened as if invisible hands were squeezing the life out of him. He tried to break free, to escape, but it was like his body had become a prison. And then the reflection stepped out of the mirror. Alex's eyes went wide with horror as he watched the figure move. Slowly, deliberately. It was him but it wasn't. It moved like him, looked like him, but its eyes, those eyes, burned with an unnatural light. The reflection was no longer a mere image. It was real. It took a step toward him, and Alex felt an overwhelming urge to back away. But his legs wouldn't move. His feet were stuck to the floor, frozen in place. The figure smiled again, its lips curling into a grin that sent a jolt of panic through his entire body. "You're mine," the reflection whispered, its voice like ice scraping against glass. Alex's heart pounded in his chest. He was trapped. There was nowhere to run. The mirror had him now, and it wasn't letting go. The reflection reached out, its hand moving toward Alex's face. He could feel its cold fingers brushing against his skin, sending chills down his spine. He wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to break free, but his body wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed. And then the reflection's hand slid into his chest. Alex's breath caught in his throat as the cold, icy fingers curled around his heart. He could feel it, like an invisible force tugging at his very soul. His vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to fade into darkness. His mind screamed for help, but there was no escape. He was sinking into the mirror's world, becoming part of it. The reflection was taking him, pulling him into a place where reality no longer existed. He was losing himself. But then, just as he thought he would be consumed completely, the world around him suddenly snapped back into focus. The mirror, no, the reflection, was gone. Alex gasped for air, his chest heaving as he stumbled backward. The room was silent again. The mirror stood before him, calm, still. But he knew better now. He knew what it could do. He could feel it like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. The reflection wasn't done with him. It was just getting started. Alex's hands shook as he stumbled back from the mirror. His heart hammered in his chest, and every breath he took felt shallow, as if the air itself was being stolen from him. He had to get away. He didn't know how or where to go, but he couldn't stay here, not with the reflection still lurking. He backed away, his feet dragging, his mind racing with questions. What had just happened? Was he hallucinating? Was he losing his mind? But no, he couldn't deny what he'd seen, what he'd felt. The reflection, no, the thing in the mirror, was real. It wasn't just some trick of the light or his imagination. It was alive, and it was coming for him. Alex tried to shake off the feeling, to convince himself that it was just a bad dream. But it was too real. The cold fingers, the voice, the way the reflection had moved like a living thing. He couldn't escape it. His eyes kept flicking back to the mirror, like some magnetic force was pulling him toward it. He tried to look away, but the reflection had a hold on him, even from across the room. He could still see it, the twisted smile, the cold, empty eyes staring back at him. It was like it was watching his every move. He ran his hands through his hair, the panic rising in his chest. He had to get out of here. He needed to get away from the mirror. But where could he go? The reflection had already followed him once. and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was everywhere now. Everywhere he looked, there it was, waiting, watching. His gaze flicked to the door. Could he leave? Would it let him? Taking a deep breath, Alex rushed toward the door. His hands fumbled for the handle, his mind screaming for him to hurry. As he turned the knob and stepped into the hallway, the air felt heavier. The walls felt tighter. It was like something was closing in on him. He looked around, but everything seemed the same. The old, dimly lit hallway, the creaking wooden floors beneath his feet. But there was something wrong about it all. Something out of place. The silence felt deafening. He could hear his own breathing, quick and shallow, but everything else was eerily still. No sound, no movement. It was like the world itself had paused, holding its breath. Alex swallowed hard. He had to keep moving. He couldn't stop now. He reached the stairs and began to descend, but as he did, the sensation of being watched only grew stronger. The air around him felt thick, suffocating. It was like the house itself was alive, breathing with him, watching him. He could almost hear the floorboards groaning under the weight of something invisible. At the bottom of the stairs, Alex paused, looking around. The house felt larger than before, more oppressive, like the walls were pressing in on him. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands trembled. He wanted to run, but he didn't know where to go. And then, a sound broke the silence. A whisper. It was faint at first, like the wind brushing against the walls. But then it grew louder, closer. The voice was soft, a low murmur, but Alex could hear it clearly now. It was calling his name. Alex! He froze. The voice was coming from somewhere nearby, but he couldn't tell where. It was so familiar, yet so wrong. It sent chills down his spine. Alex! The voice whispered again, this time more urgent. The air seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching out toward him. He felt his blood run cold. He wanted to run. He needed to escape, but his legs wouldn't move. His body felt heavy, frozen in place. The voice was pulling him in, like a rope around his neck, tightening with every breath. Alex, you can't escape, the voice hissed, and this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was more like a command, a force that was dragging him forward. His mind raced. The reflection. It was in the house. It was controlling everything. The air, the darkness, the shadows, it was all part of it, all part of that thing that had taken over his life. The voice was growing louder now, filling the space around him. It was like 1,000 whispers all tangled together, speaking his name over and over again, each one more desperate, more demanding than the last. You belong to me, Alex. His breath caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. His whole body was frozen, like it was being pulled into something deep and dark, something he couldn't escape. The shadows around him seemed to grow, stretching out like fingers reaching for him, pulling him closer to the center of the room. Alex could feel the weight of them on his skin, cold and heavy, like they were suffocating him. And then the mirror appeared again. It wasn't in the corner of the room this time. It was in front of him, right there in the middle of the hallway, standing like a portal to another world. The reflection in the glass was not his own. It was something else. A twisted, distorted version of him, grinning in the darkness. The reflection didn't move. It just stared, its eyes glowing with that cold, malevolent light. You can't escape, Alex, the voice whispered again, and Alex felt himself being pulled toward the mirror. It was like a magnet, drawing him in, his feet moving against his will. He tried to resist, to fight it, but the force was too strong. He was being pulled closer, closer to the reflection that was no longer a reflection. It was something else, something that wanted him. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to warp around him. The walls bent, the floor creaked and groaned, like the house itself was shifting, changing, reacting to the reflection's presence. Alex's heart raced. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't escape. And then, just as he was inches away from the glass, the reflection reached out and grabbed him. Alex felt a cold, skeletal grip tighten around his arm, pulling him toward the mirror. He couldn't fight it, couldn't move. The thing in the mirror wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was real, and it was dragging him into the glass. His heart pounded in his chest as the world around him seemed to blur. The shadows stretched out, reaching for him like claws. The cold fingers dug deeper into his skin, chilling him to the bone. His breath was shallow, panicked. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the suffocating silence. The reflection in the mirror grinned, its eyes glowing with a twisted hunger. Alex wanted to tear himself away, to escape, but the grip tightened. He was being pulled into the darkness, into the mirror, into the thing that was now controlling him. His body jerked as if his soul was being ripped from him. The floor beneath his feet seemed to vanish, and he stumbled forward, his body crashing into the cold surface of the mirror. The glass felt like ice, sinking into his skin like needles, and for a moment he thought he might drown in it. And then, there was a moment of stillness. The reflection stopped pulling him. Everything around him froze. Alex stood there, face pressed against the mirror, his eyes wide with fear. The room had disappeared. The hallway was gone. He was no longer in the house. He was somewhere else. Somewhere wrong. The world behind the glass was a nightmare of twisted shapes and shadowy figures. The air was thick, suffocating. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the very atmosphere was alive, suffocating him. In the distance, Alex could hear whispers. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, clearer. "Welcome, Alex," the voice murmured, so familiar, yet so cold. It wasn't the reflection. It was something worse. Alex's eyes darted around, panic flooding through his veins. He couldn't move. His body was frozen in place, like the mirror had claimed him. His heart raced, his mind screaming for him to escape, but his body wouldn't respond. He was trapped in the mirror. And then, slowly, the reflection in the glass began to move. It wasn't like before, when it had only mimicked his actions. Now it was its own being. The reflection smiled, a slow, twisted grin that sent a chill down Alex's spine. "I've been waiting for you," the reflection whispered, its voice now echoing in Alex's mind. "I've always been here." Alex's breath hitched. He wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The reflection's eyes gleamed with malice. It was no longer him. It was something else, something dark and twisted, something that had taken him. It had consumed him, and now it was in control. The reflection stepped forward, and Alex's body moved against his will, following its every step. He could feel the coldness of the mirror seep deeper into his skin, his bones, his soul. He could feel the darkness wrapping around him like chains. "You will never escape me," the reflection whispered. "You are mine now." The words echoed in Alex's mind, and he fought against them, tried to push them away. But the more he struggled, the tighter the grip on his body became. His hands shook as they reached out to touch the cold glass, as if trying to find a way back. But there was nothing. There was only the reflection, staring at him with those empty, soulless eyes. Suddenly, the reflection laughed. It was a low, guttural laugh that sent a shiver down Alex's spine. The sound seemed to fill the space, stretching out, growing louder. It was as if the reflection was feeding on his fear, growing stronger with every heartbeat. "You can't hide from me," the reflection taunted, its voice now dripping with malice. "I see everything. I am you, and you are me." Alex's heart raced faster. His chest felt tight, his head spinning. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The mirror had consumed him, and now it was a prison. A dark, endless prison with no way out. The reflection stepped closer, its grin widening. It was closer now, so close that Alex could feel its icy breath against his skin. The air grew colder still, and Alex felt the weight of the darkness press down on him, suffocating him. The reflection raised its hand, and Alex's body moved on its own. It was as if his soul was being ripped apart, his very essence being pulled toward the reflection. He could feel himself slipping, fading, becoming nothing more than a shadow. And then, the voice spoke again, louder now, stronger. "You are mine," it whispered, the words vibrating in his chest. The last thing Alex saw before he was consumed by the mirror was the reflection's twisted grin. The last thing he heard was its cold, mocking laugh.